Hi, I'm Larry Castle here with Ken Brown, and welcome to That's a Good Question, episode 29. How does the church avoid distraction? In last week's episode, we dealt with the question, how do we minister in a polarized culture? And at the end of that, we offered some advice, and that included things like diffusing our anger. We talked about the fact that human anger does not produce the righteousness that God desires, as you pointed out in James chapter 1. We talked about staying away from all of the angry voices on TV and radio and the internet. And we advise people to use forms of information that feed the mind rather than numb it. And reading over, watching all that kind of wrestling matches back and forth, the smackdown on the news channels, the put downs on Twitter. And when we feed our minds that, it feeds our disposition and our own attitudes. So beware of developing our own cancel culture. So often on Twitter, when you look at discussions Christians are having, they're spending a lot of their time simply pointing out the faults of others. Conspiracies devour all anybody who seems to be on the outside of they don't agree 100%. If you don't buy into this, then you get smashed under it. And you reminded us that if we bite and devour each other, we should watch out, or we will be destroyed by each other, as Paul tells the Galatians. So you told us to develop the humility necessary to agree to disagree without imputing motives to your opponents. So important. It's one thing to critique what a person says or what a person does, but then to assume we know why, what they're up to and their motives behind that. So we have to ask the same questions, be willing to ask the same questions, you said, even if we arrive at different answers. And finally, to filter all claims and responses through our mission. And this moment offers opportunity to demonstrate different values. As I say, this moment in our culture, we can demonstrate different values, that we are not of this world, and that our opponents are not our enemies. And we look forward to a future city whose builder and maker is God, as the writer of Hebrews tells us. So the gospel unites those who would otherwise be estranged. Paul tells the Ephesians that Christ has destroyed the dividing wall of hostility. And so then the last, I said finally earlier, but the last one from this past week introduces what we want to discuss this week. And so I'll let you take that, Pastor Ken.
Well, that's a good introduction to tie in what we ended with last week and what we want to talk about this week. At the end of last week, we said we don't want our churches, any of our churches in general, but the church that you and I are privileged to lead in particular, we don't want to become known as anything other than a community of Christians, just to be known as a Bible teaching and a Bible believing church. So we said at the end of last week, just as an example, we don't want to be known as the Republican church. We're going to look at a number of other things we don't want to be known as that are outside the gospel and outside our mission. But that's just an example in this political season. Some years ago, I was asked to go out to Denver area, and speak to a regional meeting of pastors and talk about outreach and effective outreach into our communities. And this was one of the points that I made to them. You don't want to become known as, the Republican church. I say Republican because most of the people in our churches, most of the churches with whom we would affiliate would fall in that category. So I said, you don't want to become known as that. Get this. I go out into the lobby and they have a book table, and the pastor of the host church had written some books, and almost all of his books were wedding Christianity to conservative politics. So here I was saying, you don't want to be that. And out on their book table, Sunday after Sunday, that church has that out there. So
but that was just your first visit. How's it gone on your subsequent visits? Oh, you haven't been back?
I always get one visit. That's usually it. So we don't want to be known as the Republican church, and we don't want to favor those that come into the church who might agree with us, even making it, whether it's a political thing like that or anything else that's outside the gospel, a kind of unspoken requirement for people to fit in. We joked at the end of last week that if we're not careful, we could become, a masks only church, or a non-mask only church, or a vaccine only church, or a non-vaccine only church, and we could be divided along these lines. So we need to avoid becoming distracted. In the title of our episode today, how does the church avoid distraction? We need to avoid that, especially with so much today that's available to call our attention away from what's most important, namely the gospel mission to which the Lord has called us. I remind us all that in 1 Corinthians 15, in verse 3, the Apostle Paul said, I passed on to you as of first importance that Christ died for our sins according to the scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised, and on the third day according to the scriptures. So the gospel for Paul, and it should be for us, is of, he said there, first importance. But in order to keep that as the priority, we cannot get distracted with lesser things. And the truth is, everything else is lesser when it's compared to the gospel.
Yeah. So perhaps, though, once we get past what is, by all accounts, just a crazy, unusual year, year. Did I say year? So we're in a weird year here, and
Yes.
once we get past this crazy, unusual year, perhaps then we won't have things to distract us like this.
Well, that's what I'd like to do today. I'd like to take some time, because although it's true that this has been a very unusual year, and we've had the pandemic and we've had the election, and both of those are monumental events that create a temptation toward distraction, we need to understand this, friends. Everybody, please hear this. There are always things to distract. So it's not just that we have gone through, and thankfully, we'll be coming out of in a few months, out of the pandemic with the vaccines and all that, Lord willing. But it's not just that we've gone through that. Yes, it's been very acute, very intensified during this year, but there are always things to distract. So what I'd like to do in this episode is to rehearse some of what I've seen, some of what you have seen as well over the years, that churches get involved in that pull us away from the centrality of the gospel message. As we'll see, many or perhaps none of these things that we're going to talk about are evil. They're just things that take the focus away from what is most important.
Yeah, I can think of one of those right away from my years in youth ministry. About 20 years ago, was it really 20 years ago, a book hit the Christian market called I Kiss Dating Goodbye. And, honestly, it had some really good advice in it, advice that I've used with my own daughters. But it advocated something called courtship. And, this is where you are in only a relationship with a member of the opposite sex for the purpose of marriage. And while, this is well-intentioned, and at the core of it, I like the intent of the idea. Yeah, it right. really did some damage in how it taught young people to form relationships between men and women, as they were sort of afraid to just naturally be themselves around each other. And, it hasn't ended well for many young people who were brought up in this type of an environment, and because it really didn't prepare them for a real relationship as a result. Right. In fact, many who are listening might even know that the author of the book has really rejected much of what he's taught in there, and apologized for presenting it as though it were the only way.
Yeah, well, we made that book, I Kiss Dating Goodbye, available in the past. But whenever we recommended it, we always issued a bit of a disclaimer that it has a good focus, like you said, on a number of things, including trying to maintain purity in our relationships before marriage. But some of it was heavy-handed, we said, so be careful. And you see that same kind of phenomenon, though, with a lot of things that I've observed over the years. Again, perhaps they're good things, but they kind of take on a life of their own in the church, and they become the focus. My theology teacher, the late Dr. Roland McCune, he used to say that in his decades of observing churches, he noticed that they often become known for some particular thing. And he said it was often a hobby horse of the pastor that the pastor would preach on regularly. So for example, there are a lot of legalistic churches out there. I've been exposed to a lot of legalistic kinds of churches, lots of rules that were, if not written down as part of your sanctification, they were assumed to be. It's kind of an unspoken rule. You need to follow these rules, these legal requirements in order to really be right with God. And so as an example of one of those rules, many of these churches taught, many of them still do teach, women cannot wear pants ever, because of really a misapplication of Deuteronomy chapter 22, that a woman should not wear, quote, that which pertaineth to a man. Now, when I say it that way, that which pertaineth to a man,
Pertaineth.
so you know that I'm quoting from the King James version using that language.
That's actually another example of a church getting distracted, right? Churches become known as the KJV Only Church. And, they do things like put that right into their statement of faith, that they use the only true Bible, the 1611. Nobody really uses the 1611, but, a pastor denounces any church or anyone in his church who uses another version as if they're apostate.
Yeah, that's right. That is another example, being a KJV only church, something that gets you distracted from the priority issue of the gospel mission. Many of our viewers know that I was raised in the Pentecostal church, but at age 19, I began attending a Baptist church for the very first time. It happened that church was a KJV only church, and it was exactly as you've described. In fact, there's a website called KJV Churches, kjvchurches.com, and it lists churches that use the King James, because many people who've been taught that the King James Version's the only valid English translation, when they're looking for a church, they want a website like that, and they look for a church that believes the same thing. Now get this. Several months ago, someone in our church brought to my attention that we're on the list at the kjvchurches.com, but it says of us, does not believe the King James Version. Now, what they mean by that at a King James only website, when they say you don't believe the King James Version, they mean you don't believe the King James Version is the only valid English translation, that you believe in others. In fact, in our case, when I preach and teach, when we do here, we use the New International Version. So that was brought to my attention. I contacted them. Now it appears, I checked that before our session today, it appears they've removed us from the site altogether, which is... They
don't want to promote people coming to us because we don't use the right translation.
Yeah, exactly. So that's one way. Yeah, this KJV only, that's a distraction from the gospel mission. I read an article years ago, and here was the title of this article. It was When Preference Becomes Precept, the hyphenated church. When preference becomes precept, the hyphenated church. And the author listed several preferences that people in the church or the pastors might have, which become so dominant that they are unspoken articles of faith for the church, and everybody needs to adhere to those things. Now the hyphen part comes in because the church becomes known for that particular thing. So a church that demands use of the King James would be, for example, First Baptist Church, let's say, and then also have a hyphen after that lists the preference that's now become a precept. So First Baptist Church hyphen a King James only church, or Second Baptist Church hyphen a homeschooling fellowship. Now, most don't put those things on their sign, although some of the King James people actually do put that on their sign. But most wouldn't put like homeschooling fellowship on their sign, but that's the effect. And if you go and you visit, you learn very quickly when you start attending that everybody adheres to this same thing. It may be a good thing, but it's the same extra gospel outside the
Mm.
gospel thing, and therefore it can become a distraction.
Yeah. So you mentioned courtship, or I mentioned courtship, and then now we talked about KJV only, and then you mentioned homeschooling, and that's another one that, in years of working with young people, I've seen several of these distractions related to family life. These things that become so important to the way this family wants to operate, that they want it to be, the sanctioned way to do this at their church, and have even church structured around it. And none of these things are in and of themselves necessarily bad things. I guess saying KJV is the only inspired translation is a bad thing, but
Yeah.
preferring that version,
Right.
preferring homeschool, none of these things are bad in and of themselves. So we're not saying here we're against it, but some churches say that homeschool is the only way to educate your child. So it's no surprise then that homeschoolers find their way there, and this becomes, like you said, the homeschooling church. And if you go there and your kids don't homeschool your kids, then you realize that, okay, I don't fit into this club. And then here's another one that I've seen in youth group over the years, and our own family. We've done homeschool like you have. Our kids also for a time went to a Christian school, as yours have. And you have a similar situation with Christian private school versus public school. And I'm thankful for the times when our youth group has had a good cross section of those things, so that it's a little easier to cut through those conform cliques almost.
Right. That's right. So with all of that, all of those issues, and we'll look at a few more here in a bit, but with all of them, we've got to ask ourselves, even if we have a preference for something, is it something that impacts what one pastor friend of mine says are really the standards by which we should evaluate how important something is? And he uses these three words: communication, clarity, and credibility. Communication, clarity, and credibility. And he's saying, does this affect negatively or positively our communication of the gospel? So you're still using the gospel mission as the touchstone. And is that, and does this detract in any way from our communication of the gospel? Does it enhance or detract from our clarity in presenting the gospel? And then our credibility, does it take away from our credibility if we're known and we get out there on the front lines of a particular thing? So we might differ about whether a particular thing does or does not affect communication, clarity, credibility. That's fine. As we said last week, we need to ask the same questions. We may not arrive at all the same answers. But if we do that, at least we are all saying what's most important, what is of first importance, to use biblical language, is the gospel. And we're trying to measure our involvement with this particular thing in terms of how it impacts the gospel. Now, you're right about many of these revolving around family life. You mentioned homeschooling as one example. We mentioned the courtship as another one. Some of you might be familiar with something called the family integrated movement, family integrated church. And what that is, family integrated church is promoted by some very, very good people for very, very good reasons. They're trying to strengthen families. And they see some excesses in the way that churches have gone about ministry to children, ministry to teenagers, that a lot of that has become just very entertainment oriented. And they want something more substantive, one. But then a second thing is they see that in trying to entertain the kids, and then as they become older teenagers, and then even into young adulthood, and then those young adults become older adults, and the same thing kind of is perpetuated, namely that they constantly have to have the show. They constantly have to, and they are, importantly, almost always separated from the life of the rest of the body. They've actually identified something important, because as you read through your New Testament, you don't find that. You find the body as being this cohesive unit, and you find things like Titus chapter 2, the older people in the church should teach the younger people in the church. Well, we can't really do that effectively if we're always separate from each other. if we don't have any relationships with each other. So at our own church, we've tried to make sure that we bake into the way we're structured opportunities for our teenagers, our young adults to interact with our adults. Just one example, we have home groups that meet on Sunday evenings a couple times a month. And when we reorder those every 2 years, we make sure to mix up the ages in those groups. And we have avoided the temptation, and there's been the temptation, there's been the pressure sometimes to say, let's establish, some of the groups strictly for teenagers, so they have their own group, or strictly for, young adults. We don't want to do that. We've got a teen ministry. We've got a young adult ministry. We think that's a very good thing because they have particular needs, and we want to try to address those, but we don't want to always have them separated. So this family integrated church idea is trying to combat against some real issues that have arisen in the way we minister to teens and young people and children. I get that. But the solution is not, in my view, a good one. What they say is that youth groups are just bad, and children's ministry is bad. Children's worship, children's churches is bad. You always have to have the family integrated, thus the name. And so the children are always wherever the adults are. And I think the children can gain more than we think, because I used to do it when I was a kid. I used to sit in the worship service. My dad was the Pentecostal preacher. By osmosis, you're picking up some of what's going. So I agree with that. Children can pick up more than we think. But having something targeted to our children, we think is good for them, at least sometimes, not all the time separated, as we've already said. But think about this. On Sunday morning, especially, if you're a church that wants to open its doors to everybody, not just your own church family, but also to people who are coming from the outside. How is a person from the outside in our culture that doesn't teach people, frankly, how to discipline their children, and they're going to come into church and you're going to say, what years ago we had a superintendent of our children's ministry who started to kind of buy into the family integrated idea, and we had children's church up through 5th grade like we do now, and he was saying, you know what, we don't need to do that. I mean, maximum we need to have it like through 2nd grade. By the time a kid's in 3rd grade, they ought to be able to sit with their parents in the service. Well, I said to him, and he's a wonderful guy. I said to him, that's true, depending on who you're talking about. I mean, that was true of my girls when they were that age. It was true of your girls when they were that age, because we had been taught.
Not all my girls, you know who you are.
Well,
sorry,
not both of mine at times as well. But that was because we had been taught, and our wives have been taught, how to biblically discipline our kids and have them do that, and so they could do it. But what about the people that we're trying to reach that come in and we invite to come in? And what are they going to do? And we say that, well, so we can kill both birds. We can have direct ministry to our kids. We can also have ministry, to those families. So we think that in some ways the cure is a bit worse than the disease with the family integrated, idea. Another example, a couple of more of these, family oriented examples where preferences become, this is the church. I mean, these family integrated churches, they have their own website. You can locate a family integrated church. It's got to be that way and structured that way, or for some people, they're not going to go there. Another example of that is Christian schooling. You mentioned, private Christian schools, but back in the 60s and 70s, especially into the 80s, there was this movement amongst conservative, especially independent conservative churches, that every church needed to have a school. And well, how is every church going to do that, since the average size of a church nationwide is under 100, just right around 100 people? How's a church of 100 people going to have a school? Well, the way they did it was there's the development of something called, you could Google this, it still exists, called Accelerated Christian Education, ACE schools. And an ACE school is a one-room school. You're back to the one-room school idea. You had all ages in that one room. So you might, have from 1st grade to 12th grade. And what they had was a curriculum that was published by ACE, Accelerated Christian Education. And then you had kind of a proctor, a moderator, a facilitator, teacher who didn't really do a lot of teaching, just made sure the kids were doing their workbooks. And so the kids sat in and they did the workbooks throughout the day. I have met, I'm sure a lot of people did very well with that. I have met lots of people who went through that. Their education was really lacking. Their socialization was not supplemented. If you do things like that and you don't supplement it in other ways, then they're going to suffer that way too. Here's another one. Again, family oriented, but it's on parenting. I think you guys, you and Julie, Larry, remember this, that Gary Ezzo. You remember the Ezzos?
Growing Kid God's Way?
That's what it's called. And they put out this material. And again, it just had some great stuff in it, really helpful stuff in it. It wasn't a one size fits all, but they made it. That's the problem. They made it and they implied in the material. In fact, look at the title, Growing Kids God's Way. Yeah. So this is God's way. And if you don't do it this way, well, guess what? You're doing it something other than God's way. Whole churches became Growing Kids God's Way churches. And people gravitated to those, but churches split as well because some people found, hey, this methodology is not working for me. And now people were kind of looked down on, well, you must not be doing it right. You're not disciplining your kids properly. It just became awful for a lot of people. And again, what's in common with all these? These are extra gospel things outside the gospel that they move from a preference to a precept. Political activism can do that. Social activism can do that. The list is almost endless of the kinds of things where we can get off on this if we're not careful. Yeah,
I think it would be good for us to have an episode devoted to doctrinal issues that divide Christians, because we're talking about this. And, there are some things that are worth disagreements and division rising up over because they're about what does the Bible clearly say. And so it is better to be divided. If you're going to be divided over anything, doctrine would need to be, it needs to be that important because that's more than a preference, as you were saying. But right. It's still hard to know what are the doctrines that are important enough, clear enough to divide over. So that'd be a good thing for us to discuss next week even.
Yeah, I think let's do that. Let's for our next episode, let's talk about that. I think it's a timely topic. I think it would be a helpful topic. Jesus said in Matthew chapter 23, he said that he castigated the religious leaders of his day. And he was saying that you give attention. You remember he said to them that you strain out a gnat, but you swallow a camel. Remember that? And he was saying you give attention to these most minute details in your tithing. You tithe on mint and dill and cumin, these spices, every small thing. You're doing this meticulously, but you omit, and this is a key phrase, we'll talk about it next week. You omit the weightier matters of the law. So what is Jesus saying there? He's saying that, it's not, in fact, he said to them, you ought to have done those things. Those things that you're doing were not bad. You ought to have done those without neglecting the other. And the other is weightier, Jesus said. So all these things are important, but some things are most important. And when we focus upon these preference kinds of issues, then we can wind up focusing on lesser things. And even in the Word of God, not everything is equally important. So we should look at what doctrinal issues are most important and why next week. So one thing that'll help us as leaders, and then all of us as brothers and sisters to think about these things, is looking at Scripture and looking at what does Scripture prioritize. Passage I read earlier from 1 Corinthians 15, Paul says the gospel is of first importance. I mean, that's pretty straightforward, isn't it? This has got to be at the top of the list. He's saying that. So we know that. So let's play off of that. But then other things that the Bible says are of great weight and gravity. So let's see what those are. But here's another thing. Knowing a little bit about history helps you not to avoid repeating it. That the saying, it's George Santayana is the one who said that those who fail to know their history are destined to repeat it. And
isn't it doomed to repeat it?
Doomed to repeat it. Thank you. So yeah, it's doom, and it is that. And so it's a calamity, and it's an avoidable one if we will take the time to know a little bit about history. that's true of church history as well. Even recent church history, like we've been recounting here, some of the fads that have come and gone have become the preference that became a precept for then hyphenated churches, and they end up splitting churches and all of that. Well, likewise, just take what I mentioned a bit ago, social activism, is doing benevolence, doing what some call, I like this phrase, mercy ministry for those in the community. Is that a bad thing? No, I consider it actually quite a good thing. I'm very thankful that around this Christmas time that our church has been able to, we helped 12 families with a Christian foster care agency, 12 children for their Christmas, and bought gifts for them. We were able to help 5 families in the public school here in our town in Trenton, Michigan. They gave us some names, and we gave them gift cards, and generous gift cards for them to have a good Christmas. I'm thankful whenever we're able to do that. And we want to do that kind of thing. And we want to be a people known for good works, known for benevolence, known for loving our neighbor to the greatest extent we can. But if you know some history, you'll be careful about it, because being social, if you're not careful, can become the gospel itself. And in fact, historically, there's a thing called the social gospel for that reason. And the gospel message became obscured and overtaken by the charitable, the benevolent works that were done. So knowing that history means you could go ahead and do it, but ever mindful, the gospel is always the most important. So if we do that, then we can navigate through this and figure out what things are most important, what things are distractions, make sure we avoid those. So we church leaders, guys like us, our other elders, the rest of our leadership team in our church and in all gospel-loving and Bible-believing churches, we need to be keenly aware of any issues that fall outside those 3 things I mentioned earlier: the communication, the clarity, the credibility of the gospel, and then ensure that we don't inadvertently add issues and ministries to the church's agenda that end up distracting us from the main thing. Last reference I'll give, but I think it's an important one, in Ephesians chapter 4. After Paul, who wrote that, gives 3 chapters worth, 3 full majestic chapters of all God has done going back to eternity past. You go to Ephesians chapter 1 to plan our salvation, and then talks about the execution, the carrying out of that salvation. And then in chapter 3, he talks about now that God has brought us into his family, into his church, the role of the church and being central to what God is doing in his world. And it's just beautiful, 3 chapters. But then switches in chapter 4 to, in effect, saying, okay, with all that, now what do you do with it? How do you carry it out in practice? And this is what he says: I urge you then to live a life worthy of the calling you have received. Be completely humble and gentle. Be patient, bearing with one another in love. Now notice this: make every effort to keep the unity of the Spirit through the bond of peace. Lots of threats to that unity of the Spirit, but one of those major threats is getting involved with preferences that become precepts and that distract us from the gospel.
One good thought to end on. Yeah, if something is going to cause there to be division, it should be, like we'll talk about next week, something that is unavoidable. Right. We cannot escape it, because the Bible clearly says it.
That's right.
Great. All right. Well, thanks for going over this topic today. This is great discussion, and I hope you watching have found this helpful as well. Want to just remind you that you can keep up with our content that we provide like this every week by following our Facebook page, liking us on Facebook, that is, and also if you're watching this on our YouTube channel, hitting the subscribe button and even that notification bell, so you'll get a notification every time we produce a new episode. And Pastor Ken, thanks as always for the great background on these topics and the time and thought you put into these topics. And thanks everybody for watching, and we will see you in the next episode. If you have a question you'd like us to consider, you can send that in to our email address, info@cbctrenton.com, or text it to us at 97000.